Welcome back. You're watching CrossRoads with Neethan, Shan. We're talking about a policing practice called carding, the impact of it, and what could be done about it. So we have heard from MPP Jagmeet Singh earlier about some of the things that could be done provincially, but before we end the show, it's appropriate to have community voices heard on this topic. So we have two amazing local activists who do a lot of work in the community. We have Sabrina Butterfly Gopal. Sabrina works with Jane and Finch Actions Against Poverty, anti-poverty group in Jane and Finch neighborhood, and we also have Ajamu Nagwaya. Ajamu is part of the Network for Elimination of Police Violence. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks for taking the time to share. So let's start with asking you, Ajamu, what carding has been going on for a while. With different names and so on, but recently has gotten a lot of attention as well. So let's define what the practice is, or even give an explanation of what the practice is.
Well, carding is a repressive policing tool. To the police, it's an investigative information collection procedure. What carding is where the police will stop, question, and document your information, and also store it in databases on people who are not suspected of a crime or not seen in the process of committing a crime. So people are stopped in non-criminal encounters, and that is what makes it very repressive. And it's like you're in constant surveillance.
And research has shown, but anecdotally we had known that certain racialized communities, particularly the black community, has been overrepresented in the number of people who are carded, right? So has there been a bit of a understanding in the general population that this practice is particularly disproportionately used, as therefore it's racial profiling as well as violation of human rights? Or?
Well, within the African community, it's well known. In Toronto right now, people find it objectionable that in May, a poll found that 60% of Torontonians are opposed to the practice. Whether it's because it's disproportionately affecting African people, that's, the poll didn't really focus on that. It's just that it's objectionable to a majority of Torontonians.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm thinking that, for any individual, if they haven't done anything wrong, to be treated that way, not necessarily be consulted about something that's happening, but more for kind of intimidation in some ways when you take your information and write it down. So you work a lot with community members, and particularly community members who may be impacted by practices like this. What are you hearing on the ground of people who are impacted? What kind of impact does it have on them?
Well, the impact isn't just the person who gets carded. It's everybody. It's the person that's witnessing it. It's the family the person's attached to. Community is asked a number of times, how is this bringing down crime, this practice of carding? And that still hasn't been revealed to community or the public, how carding as a tool has reduced crime. So it's been a violation of people's rights. And like you said, it's a practice that's been going on for many years. I mean, it's named carding now, but the fear and the terror that comes along with carding is something that can't be measured and isn't really talked about a lot.
And it's not clear what the information is being used for as well, right? I mean, I'm sure it's being used for future things, but if I haven't done anything, why am my information being stored as well? So let's talk a bit about the attention it's getting in various places. Both the media has been catching on this, some of the political folks have been talking about it as well, and particularly because there has been a change in leadership in the police forces, chief of police. There's also been some conversation around it, right? So let's talk a bit about this optics of a black person, a black Canadian, becoming the police chief, and the person not taking a very strong stand against carding, and how that translates into the community activism that's being done as well.
Well, the first thing we should acknowledge is that police exist to serve and protect the ruling class in any society. It means that they're supporting the most dominant social groups. So it doesn't matter who the police chief is. They're not on the side of the oppressed. If workers are striking, it doesn't matter the race of the police officer, police chief. They're under the side of big business. If indigenous people are rebelling against their colonialism in Canada, the police, even if the police is police chief is an indigenous person, they will be on the side of law and order. So people shouldn't expect an African police chief to make a difference. Otherwise, in South Africa, the police chief would be a very kind and gentle person, or in Nigeria. It doesn't matter the race of the police chief.
As a system, there is systemic issues, systemic bias that needs to be addressed. So young people often cite lack of trust as the reason why they're not cooperating with police officers, why they're not going and telling about a difficult situation that they're facing, or their surrounding or their peers are facing, right? Whether it be school administration or police, the number one thing young people talk about is trust, right? Has this practice further hurt that level of trust?
I think if we're talking about the young people now, I don't think there was ever a level of trust. I think trust has been diminished over decades and decades of relations and interactions. The no accountability of the mistreatment, the brutality that's happened. There's no accountability from the police, and that's a huge problem. You have TAVIS that's hugely funded in our neighborhood, and Jane and Finch is the only neighborhood that has TAVIS all year round. And we, as a community, are dealing with a lot of economic and social barriers. So even levels of the government continue to earmark and put all these resources into policing in a police state, but not to the hands of people in enabling and empowering them to get out of poverty. I think this also demonstrates a mistrust. Who's the police protecting? Because it's not the young people in the neighborhood, and because of the generations of mistrust and this relationship, this isn't just young people feeling this. This is their fathers and their grandfathers that have gone through brutal force of the police. And I'm speaking.
Young people have grown up seeing that their parents and grandparents.
Exactly. You know, police could be useful, maybe in some ways, if it's domestic violence, let's say. But time and time again, you'll hear women waiting for the police hours, or if not until the next day before they come. So I mean, we tend to look at carding, or not just carding, but the attitudes of police with young black men. But this is something that community at large are feeling. When police come into a community and start questioning and targeting a young person, and an elder's trying to support a young person, and they're lashed by the police. This is real experiences that are happening all the time. And it's not just one people or one person that's experiencing, it's a community that's witnessing and experiencing this.
So structurally, I mean, if carding was to be banned, would problems be resolved is the question. There are other structural stuff that we need to talk about as well. So what is your suggestion in terms of looking at carding as part of a structural issue that exists within the police forces? Because I think there's been a focus on the term of carding and the practice of carding, but just to get a bit of an overview.
As long as we live in an oppressive society, the police will have to police the oppressed in that society, the most oppressed group. It's not an accident that indigenous peoples in this country and African people, the two most economically marginalized groups, are overrepresented in the prison system, or the criminal or the prison industrial complex in Canadian society. The police will always have an antagonistic relationship with the most oppressed. So it's not a question of just carding, but it's a question of we organizing to fight police violence, because until we end oppressive society, we'll always be in conflict with the police. So carding is just one issue that we're dealing with. And since we have the right not to share our information with the police, as oppressed people, that's a stance you must take. If the police come and ask you about the weather, you just ask them, am I being detained? Am I free to go? You have no friendship with them, no relationship. It's an antagonistic one. They're not our friends. The police are not our friends. That when they come to you and ask for information, you're almost like a suspect, especially when you're from the most oppressed sector in society.
So how does, I mean, as youth workers, sometimes we tell young people to exercise their rights and so on, right? But at the same time, when they do exercise their rights, they get into further complications because they're not protected in any ways for exercising their rights, right? So it's one of those things where you have to be carefully advising young people to be like, know when you're confronting power, to be able to. So as someone who works in the neighborhood, do you see that? How do you deal with this? You know what your rights and responsibilities are, but sometimes you almost don't want to tell people, there were certain times that you don't want to exercise it fully, right? To be on your safe side.
Yeah, and it gets more complicated too. So I think knowing your rights is a part of the struggle, but we've seen in the community when people are aware of their rights, it's not treated with love. Like, we heard a lot of stories from young people getting beaten up by the police because they knew their rights. And before anything happens, an interaction will happen. And it's usually confrontational, and the young person's left with nothing. All the systems to hold the police accountable for any kind of violence or brutality is broken. And then there's other layers to it to make it even more complicated. You have provincial law that can oversee the municipal law. So a lot of these private places like plazas, Toronto Community Housing, schools, Parks and Rec, they're in agreement with the police to enforce the Trespassing Act. So if a young person doesn't know that they're on a property that's private property, this can make their knowing their rights really not knowing their rights. So it's so complicated for an individual, in particular a young person who is trying to be young, to navigate these complicated systems, and who's not doing anything wrong and has to defend just being young. So it is complicated, and it's really stacked up against community to really advocate for themselves, and to even hold themselves to human rights framework, because the reality is, in particular communities, particular bodies don't have rights, and that is the root of all of these conversations, I think.
So let's, this is a show that's telecast through Tamil television and reaches a mostly Tamil audience. So in terms of talking about solidarity, and also the carding has impacted South Asians as well, from, personally having seen many people who I hang around with as well in my high school times and so on be impacted as well, but not as heavily used against South Asian as is done, used disproportionately high on the Black Canadian population as well, right? So what kind of message can you share with Tamil Canadians on this topic, as in terms of in the time of solidarity necessary for this?
Well, police violence also, as I mentioned earlier, affect the South Asian community, because there's almost like a racial hierarchy that Africans in the city are affected disproportionately by carding. Then you have South Asian and West Asian, like Arabs and South Asians as a group. There's a diversity.
Security agenda.
Yeah, and just even carding in general, like for Arabs, yes, they're over-policing around terrorism, but just in general, there's a racial hierarchy. Then above South Asian, below South Asian, they have East Asian, are not overrepresented in carding, but they're also carded. And then, of course, whites are carded at a lower rate. So the thing is just that once one group is affected by something, all of us should stand in solidarity. In the 1970s and 80s, and even early 90s, when Africans were being killed and harassed by the police, a lot of other racialized communities just held their heads down and said, I'm not going to intervene. But then we experienced 9/11, and then when different groups started to get targeted as racialized people, then people discover racial profiling. But we were experiencing it a long time, and you didn't have a lot of communities standing in solidarity. It's for that reason that Martin Luther King made us the statement that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we all should stand in solidarity, even if we're not directly affected by something, because when you have an environment where the rights of one group is violated, you create a condition for your rights to be violated tomorrow. So we need solidarity with each other on issues that may affect us.
So we're going to take a quick commercial break now. After a few commercials, we'll come back and talk a bit about what can be done about these situations, particularly around carding, but also generally about building better, effective ways in which we can address some of these racial profiling as well. So please stay tuned. After a few commercials, we'll continue.